Welcome to Feeling Beings Who Think, a podcast project that seeks to find wisdom in conversation through the stories and personal reflections of regular people like you and me. My name is Ariane Rice, and I'm really grateful you're here. So let's get started. Have you ever had the experience of auditioning? Standing alone on a stage or in a room? Maybe there are just 3 people behind a table looking at you, or maybe, if you're on a stage, there's an unknown number out there in the cavernous space of a theater. Well, auditioning as a classically trained singer for opera roles or competitions is something I used to do with some frequency. And when I hear the word vulnerability, it is always the first image that comes to mind. To be in those situations, offering a unique part of myself, my own voice, I would be filled with both hopeful excitement that something I really wanted and sometimes believed I deserved was possible. But at the same time, I would be filled with fear and anxiety that there was no way I was good enough in comparison to these other singers, or that I wouldn't be able to even demonstrate my ability because I would be so scared and anxious I wouldn't be able to breathe. Well, my guest today is a returning one, the Reverend Steve Paulikas, and I asked him back to talk with me about ambition and courage and vulnerability, the swirl of emotions that all of us might feel when it comes to wanting to put ourselves out there to offer our gifts in service of our callings, careers, and vocations. Steve was recently a candidate for bishop in the Diocese of NY in the Episcopal Church. Now, if church isn't your thing, I hope you'll still give this a try. We talk about intentions and values when making major career decisions, and I think Steve offers real wisdom towards a quality of leadership decision-making that we also call discernment. And if church is your thing, great, because you'll get that, plus a personal reflection on a process that all of us think about in this line of work, and on some level, all of us participate in. I want to thank Steve for sharing so personally about this experience, and I want to thank you for listening. And if I may ambitiously ask for taking a moment to share this podcast with someone in your world. Thanks. Let's get to our conversation. Good morning, Steve Paulikas.
Good morning, Ariane.
Welcome back to Feeling Beings Who Think.
Wow, it's great to be back. Thank you. And a lot's happened since the last time that we talked.
A lot has happened, and I'm eager and excited for this conversation. I want to start by letting everybody know that this is a conversation where we are going to be talking about ecclesiastical leadership and some of the processes by which we choose leaders in the Episcopal Church. And if you are not an Episcopal Church person or a church person in any capacity, I think you will find points of resonance, points of curiosity in this conversation, no matter what. What do you think about that, Steve?
I have to consult Canon 3.2.6.9, but I think it might say that that's possible.
Yes. One of the reasons I was drawn to a project that's a podcast that's intentional conversation with leaders is because I believe that the capacities of leadership are things many of us want to develop and grow, particularly as we enter into second half of life ways of being. And a lot of the capacities in leadership are capacities of the spirituality of our humanity.
Beautiful.
So now that we've gotten that little preamble, what I want to talk about in particular, what I've asked Steve to come on and talk about with me, is that he was recently in what we call the process to become a bishop. And if you don't know anything about the church, you might immediately picture somebody at the top of the ladder of our proverbial career chain. And that wouldn't be too far from the truth. And I think we'll get into explaining some of what being a bishop is and what it means. But I really want to start with what was a very intense day which was the day of the election. And in all honesty, I wasn't even really going to watch it. I'm here in Maryland and Baltimore. I'm in a different diocese. Steve, what diocese are you actually in?
I'm in the Diocese of Long Island, which is Brooklyn, Queens, Nassau, and Suffolk. But I was a candidate for bishop in the Diocese of New York, which is Manhattan, Staten Island, and then the Bronx, Westchester, and several upstate counties. It was a big day, December 3rd, 2022. And apparently you were going to ding my ratings by not even bothering to watch, Ariane.
Sorry.
But, and when you say watch, it was a live stream of the election that was taking place, because in the Episcopal Church, the way that bishops are selected is they are elected by the diocesan convention, which is all of the priests and deacons, and then lay people who are elected from each of their separate parishes to represent the parish. So in order to be elected bishop, you have to get a majority of both the clergy and the laity. So usually it doesn't really happen right away, and there are several ballots. Kind of think about like the speaker race that we had at the beginning of the year. Is kind of like that, except with a little bit less, like Donald Trump, I don't think called any one of us to change our votes, but I don't know. Who knows what happened in that election, because it was wild.
Okay, so let's talk about why it was wild. And yes, it's the clergy votes and the lay votes, or the ordained people and the people who aren't ordained. And it's happening at this annual meeting called Diocesan Convention. So it was a Saturday. I was in DC visiting with a friend who happened to be in town, and we were having a lovely brunch. And I said, hey, do you mind if I just check in? Because now that we're all online, even in the church, do you mind if I just check in on this election for my good friend Steve, see what's going on? And we did. And it was the first ballot. And on the first ballot, well, I don't know what else to say, except you were neck and neck with another friend and colleague of mine and ours, the Reverend Matt Hyde. And there were 3 other people on the ballot at that point. And in the church, that was kind of exciting, right? It was exciting that, wow, all these votes.
I love that in the church, that was exciting.
Yes. How did it feel when you saw that first ballot?
Yeah, it was pretty wild. And I just want to say, like, all 4 of the other candidates are really excellent, wonderful people, excellent priests. It wasn't like a competitive kind of thing where we were trying to tear each other down. It's really just offering yourself, and then the people discern how they feel that they are being led. So when that first vote came up, I think I was like second in the clergy and first in the laity. Sort of typically in these elections, whoever is in that position winds up being elected. So I was like, whoa, okay, dang. Like I'm really like, I've got to kind of prepare for this. And I mean, I had been preparing because the process began, this was December, the process began in April, and there were just so many steps. The closer it got to the election, the more all-consuming it became to my life. So it's not as if I had just sort of casually, tossed my name in,
right,
and then just see how this happens. But this was the culmination of months and months and months of very hard work and a lot of prayer and conversations and things like that. So then to have that moment where it just kind of like the numbers came up, it was exciting, but I was just kind of treating it pretty practically and just trying to figure out, what to do. And that morning I got up pretty early, and I had a nice long period of prayer and meditation and just try to get my head straight. And, honestly, just, say to God, okay, I've done everything I can do, and now everything is up to you. And maybe that sounds super pious or whatever, but it's the only way I know how to deal with things like this. So as I looked at it, I just thought, well, okay, this is actually happening. And I was just at home watching it on the live stream, but it was actually taking place in the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in Morningside Heights, which is the cathedral of the Diocese of New York. As far as I understand, it's the largest Gothic cathedral in the world. So
yes,
it's not like it wasn't like a little, it wasn't in a conference room at a Marriott. This is like, high drama. And the live stream began with a Eucharist and a sermon by the current diocesan bishop, Andy Dici. And then sort of, there are all these kind of preliminary things, and the votes began. And my heart was racing as I was watching it. Jesse, my husband, was kind of out doing something during that first part, and I was just sitting by myself watching it. And I was like, oh no, this is really crazy. So that first vote came in and I was like, wow, I really have to focus on this right now. And honestly, like, my main feeling was just gratitude. Like, you see those numbers and it's just like, those are actual human beings who feel that God is calling me to be their bishop, and who am I? It's kind of an amazing moment.
So it's impressive to me that your primary feeling, or the top feeling, is gratitude. And I think that's wonderful. And I imagine, and you sort of alluded to it, that wasn't the only thing you were feeling. And you've already talked about, feeling anxiety and awareness, trying to get focused. This is really happening. Again, I think these are things all of us can relate to. And I kind of want to get to, then the last ballot came and it took 4 ballots. And that is unusual. And the last ballot came and it was just you and Matt, because by that point, everybody else had withdrawn, because it was clear that the 2 of you were the contenders. And, again, it was a very close vote. He had 57% of the clergy. You had 43. He had 51% of the people. You had 48. So those were very close numbers. And the bishop called the winner first and made an announcement that he would do that. And so all of us sat with sort of bated breath, who were watching online, being like, oh my gosh, who is he calling? Then it was announced, that Matt Hyde was going to be the bishop coadjutor.
Yeah, great TV, by the way. That's, way to keep people on for like the last commercial break, is to come out and say, someone's been elected, but I'm not going to tell you who it is. I'm going to go call him.
Yeah, and I just want to conclude, sorry, but I just want to conclude by saying, at that point in the National Portrait Gallery, I was sitting on a bench. I told Melissa I could not look at anything else but my phone. I apologized profusely. And then when that announcement was made, I burst into tears.
Aww.
Because I was flooded with both feelings of incredible joy for one friend and incredible sadness for another friend. And it was
you were joyful for me and sad for Matt, right?
That's a great attitude. Yeah, I was feeling all the feelings for both of you. And I think I just want to say how courageous I think it is that both of you put yourself forward for a position of tremendous responsibility and leadership, and a process that is incredibly courageous and vulnerable. So I definitely want to say that too.
Well, thank you, Ariane. I really appreciate that. And you're right. It is like, it's a tremendous amount of vulnerability. I mean, in that moment, Bishop Dici announced that there is he's going to call the person who was elected, and Jesse was in the room at this point, along with a couple of our dearest friends who had invited to sort of be with me. And the live stream sort of went down, while he was making the call, and we just like sat, like my phone was just on the table, and we were kind of like staring at it. And I got kind of so nervous, I started pacing and stuff, then I came and sat down. Then just like after about 10 minutes, like the live stream just came back up, and I was like, okay, I guess it wasn't me. And that was, there was something kind of symbolic about that a little bit, about the kind of, how to put it exactly. Yeah, I mean, it takes a lot of courage to do that. And then to kind of like find out that way that that's how you didn't get this thing.
Yeah, you found out really publicly in front of everybody all at the same time.
Yes. So actually, I knew probably just a split second before anyone else did, because my phone hadn't rung and no one had called me. It was kind of apparent to me. And then I had, between the third and the fourth ballot, because it was so close, I thought, wow, I actually think I'm going to be elected, because I kind of figured that and I just want to give a shout out to the amazing fellow candidates at this point who had dropped out. Matt Mead, Jamon Taylor, and Stephanie Johnson, because the courage that you were talking about applies to absolutely everyone, and everyone is having a different experience of it.
Right.
So, but I kind of figured that the person who dropped out most recently, that most of his votes would go to me, just kind of, that's what I'd sort of expected. So, and there was kind of a long break between those ballots. So in that period of time, I knew that the person who was elected would have to give a speech. So I kind of finished tweaking my speech, and I had it set up in the church, which I live right next door to the church. So I was going to speak from there. And I put on a suit coat just in case I had to go online. And then I went and I knelt at the altar rail in the church. I kind of left everyone and went in there because I didn't know what else to do. And I was kind of very anxious. And I just said a prayer. And in my prayer, I said, if this is your will, it's going to require a tremendous amount of me and it's going to change my life. And I just only ask that it doesn't like destroy my life, which has been my prayer kind of going all along, because it's a very, very challenging position in the church. And then I came back in and then that's what happened. And the vote was announced. I think in the lay vote, it was like 96-90. So, if 4 lay people would have, thought a different way or voted a different way, we would have had a 5th ballot. So it was pretty razor thin. My first thought as I was sort of processing what was happening was like, okay, what happened? All right, so I wasn't elected. My next thought was really like relief more than anything else. And because I knew going into it what a tremendous responsibility this position was. But it isn't until you actually sort of see it from the inside that you can tell like how difficult it actually is. And I'm the rector of All Saints Church in Park Slope. It's a beautiful and wonderful place. It's lots of hugs and kisses. We're kind of surrounded in like a bubble of Holy Spirit love. I don't know how else to put it. It's a wonderful, I love coming to the church every Sunday. The Sunday after the walkabout, which is I can get to later, where we spent traveling the Diocese of New York, that was really, really, really challenging. That was the most challenging thing I've ever had to do in my ministry. And then I came to church and it felt like slipping into a bubble bath. I was preparing to exit the bubble bath and enter like an ice bath was what it felt like.
So maybe we could break down a little bit. First, what calls you to even want this job? And sure, it's a calling and we use these religious words and it's a job, which I do think is something we realize more and more as we work in the institution of organized religion. So what called you into wanting that job? And then you said something really interesting. You said you went on the walkabouts, which is this process of getting to meet people throughout the diocese and going to different churches, answering questions. And that was really challenging. You used the word challenging. What was so challenging? What was it that you saw? So that's a pretty long question. But right at the beginning, what even called you forward?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like, well, why do anything? I love this church. What we have to offer is truly what our society needs. I think the best of what we have to offer is the spiritual medicine that our truly broken society needs. Not
Say
everything.
More. What is that medicine?
I think people were really thinking during the pandemic about what really matters. And church is everything that people were deprived of. It is making meaning out of things that have no meaning. It is authentic, loving community. It is living your values. It's being surrounded by beauty. It's one of the reasons why the pandemic was so difficult. So much of what has sort of taken over our society is this result of isolation and vapidness and like meanness and things like that. And you can't do that when you're in community with other people, or when it happens, it's of a different kind. So the message of the gospel and the way that we do it, that is inclusive and invites everyone in, is something that I think is sorely needed. And I, like you, have dedicated my vocational life to advancing that and doing that work.
Can you just say, when you say the message of the gospel is something that is sorely needed, what is the message of the gospel?
That God is love, and the greatest thing that we can do in this life is love God and love our neighbor. I think that if that's the only message that got through, and our presiding bishop is really good, I think, at nailing the great commandment and messaging that. And he's right to do that because Jesus, he's following Jesus' lead. That's Jesus messaging. If that's the only message that that our church has to offer, that's enough. That's enough. Because it's not the way we are living today as human beings in this society. So the Episcopal Church has a way of doing it that is compelling and welcoming and beautiful. Institutionally, if you sort of wind back a little bit, the conversations that happen farther away from actual parish ministry oftentimes have to do with trying to solve this problem of demographic decline that our institution is facing, which is very real. And oftentimes I see the solutions being kind of depressing, like consolidating resources, just shutting things down. How do we make things smaller? I actually think that our solution is to go bigger, not in every single case, but my parish is 3 times the size it was 10 years ago when I started ministering alongside people here. People want what we have to offer. And I think that one of the reasons that I got as many votes as I did was that people found that message really compelling. And, I was coming through and offering something that we all kind of know, but when a leader is saying it, it activates something in you to make you believe that it's true and gives you the green light to go ahead and be bold too. That's the reason I got into this, because I understand that in our structure, you called the bishop kind of at the top of the ladder. I might nuance that a little bit. It's a particular office, but there truly is nothing like the office of the bishop to impact the wider system of the diocese. And New York is such an important diocese. I mean, it sits in the media capital of the English-speaking world. So if you want to get a message out, the Bishop of New York is a really great person to do that. And I wanted to find a way to get this message out. And I thought if I have the opportunity to offer my perspective in this platform with these people, maybe people will listen. And I think they did. I think one of the reasons that there were people watching this election online like you, in a totally different part of the country was because it is New York and people watch and care about what's happening here. I've lived in New York for 17 years and I kind of get that. So that's what drew me to it. And, along the way, I met some absolutely incredible people, and also, and wound up, I think, naming publicly some of the real challenges the Diocese of New York face. I think everyone kind of knows it in the diocese, and it's sometimes a little unpleasant to talk about. But someone had to point out maybe the way we're structuring things is not the best way to organize us around the mission of delivering this life-saving and life-changing message in the gospel of Jesus Christ. So that's why I wanted to do it, because I sit back so often and kind of look at what happens in church and put on my critical brain. I'm like, why is this decision being made? That was like, they should have done that differently. And I thought, well, okay, if you really think that, then put your money where your mouth is, and this opportunity is open, and you might as well put your name in and just see what happens.
Well, yes. And I think everybody on the call in different ways, not on the call, everybody listening to the podcast in different ways relates to their own feelings of ambition, of wanting to live purposefully and meaningfully and grow, and to move into something that's new and exciting, because it actually is challenging in and of itself. I think I would like to talk just for a moment about like what a bishop does and what it is, because one of the things you and I talked about when I reached out about being on having this conversation was you and I attended a conference years ago, more at the start of our ministry. And it was a conference very specifically for, I think, clergy under 40 or something like that.
Wow. So this was a long time ago.
It was a long time ago. And I remember at this conference, there was a table that said it had like a tent on it or something that identified the table. Sit here if you want to be a bishop. And I was both internally and quietly, and did not share this with anybody, very intrigued and yearning to sit at that table, because I had just gotten into this and it seemed like that was as I said, top of the ladder. And at the same time, I was aghast that people would actually be bold enough and have what I considered at that time, pride, to sit at a table claiming that that's where they wanted to go in their calling and career. And I don't know, I just kind of want to hear a little bit more about that feeling of ambition, because I don't think we really talk about that very much in holy contexts, religious contexts.
I went to a conference in February of this year where there was a church service that culminated with Raphael Warnock preaching. So he's the senator from Georgia, just reelected. And before that, he was the pastor at Ebenezer Baptist Church.
Yes.
And so you don't really, if you hear him give a political speech, I hadn't heard him preach. I'm kind of jaded when it comes to listening to sermons. I was almost in tears. Like, it was one of the best sermons I've ever heard. He is such an incredibly talented preacher. And what did he preach about? This man who had just gotten elected to the US Senate, kind of against all odds. He preached about humility. So, I think there's a way in which humility and ambition can sit together, and actually a humble leader is a really good leader, especially in a Christian context. And just because you're humble doesn't mean you can't have any ambitions. So I have ambitions for my church. I have ambitions for the wider church. I have ambitions for how to spread this message and how to connect with people and reach them. I have ambitions for my own personal growth and what I want in my life. And there's nothing wrong with any of those things. I mean, Jesus was pretty ambitious. He could have
he was.
Stayed in Nazareth and had a delightful career as a carpenter. And he chose not to do that because there was something very important. He was also profoundly humble, and he used his ambition to do truly unexpected things and connect with people who weren't accustomed to having a prominent person see them or care about them. And that's a pretty inspiring ambition to have. I remember one time I heard the former presiding bishop, Catherine Jefferts-Schori, talk, and someone asked her a question about authority. And she said, the purpose of gaining authority is to give it away. And that really made a big impression on me. I think that's not a whole philosophy, but I think as a concept, think about if, leaders in the secular realms of our society sought ambition so that they could give it away or lift other people up who don't have it. I mean, people constantly are talking about that, but, when it actually happens, it's a powerful thing.
Well, maybe you could speak to some of the challenges, because I think some of the, challenges in the secular world are just as part of our world too. And they do have to do with things like money and funding and assets and how they're best utilized. So how did that enter into, what you were experiencing in the process as you were learning about the responsibility of the office?
We could talk for hours and hours and hours about the particularities of the episcopate and the Diocese of New York and the challenges that exist there. I was cooking in this stew for the better part of 2022, so I have a lot of thoughts about it. What I think is the biggest sort of spiritual challenge, I was naive before I entered this process about the role that, in particular, one thing plays in our church, and that's money. A lot of the challenges that we face as a church and as clergy, and you talk about ambition and everything, is that we have always, since the founding of our church, actually valued money. And the way that we have acquired money has not always been above board. It's been through racism, colonialism, slavery. And even now, it's like churches in New York, and I'm not knocking this because I'm considering doing this at my own church. Property values are through the roof in New York, have been for a long time. And doing a real estate deal is one of the great ways of, unlocking the wealth that's in your church grounds. I mean, but we only have the privilege of doing this because our churches are sitting on this incredibly valuable property because we were here first, you know? So we're all kind of implicated in it. And when you talk about ambition in the church, and when I look at it, like a lot of it is, for clergy at least, going to the places where the resources are. It's complicated, but the Bishop of New York is in charge of 182 congregations across the Diocese of New York. And if you added up the value in terms of liquid assets and real estate of those 182 parishes, it's in the tens of billions. I might be underestimating. I'm underestimating. See, I'm naive. There you go. I think the biggest challenge when you cut down through everything is that we would be foolish to simply give that all away. But that is also what Jesus is telling us to do if you want to be a Christian. And I think that as Episcopalians, we have not figured that out.
Well, it's interesting because in Scripture, there's there's many references, and there's one very directed comment to one specific individual that says you need to give away everything you have.
Mhm.
And there's, do not store up for yourself treasures on earth, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven. It's easier for a rich man to walk through the eye of a needle, or whatever that saying is that we all know.
Welcome to the Episcopal Church. Two
Right.
clergy struggling to quote the scripture.
We can't entirely, we know it. We know it really well. I can preach on it in a minute. We're definitely not a prosperity gospel church, right?
No.
Yeah. And at the same time, we do have much prosperity, both among our membership and with the assets and what we have. Yet a few times in the conversation, you've gone back to saying, but the ultimate challenge is a spiritual challenge.
Yes.
The thing that we are seeking, that the world is seeking, is a spiritual hole to be filled.
Yeah. Can I just jump in there for a second?
Yes.
Because you're saying, so what would be the challenge of being a bishop? And I think the bishop is a spiritual leader. The bishop is the spiritual leader of the diocese. And because of the way Episcopalians think of the world, it's like, I'm in Park Slope. My parish isn't the people who come to the church. My parish is the whole neighborhood. So, tomorrow I'm going to go officiate a funeral for someone I've never met because I was asked to do it. And it's in my parish. So I'm spiritually responsible for what's happening here. That's the way I'm an Anglican. That's the way I view it. I think the challenge is you're sitting on top of hundreds of billions of dollars with all of the secular concerns that come with that. How do we govern this? How do we manage it? You've got a whole staff, all these clergy, all this stuff, and all these kind of like secular world concerns. But you're also ultimately a spiritual leader. So how do you do that? That's the big challenge. And it's something that I think, if you really want to talk to someone about the episcopate, you should have a bishop on your podcast, because neither of us really knows what it's like to be a bishop.
This is true.
But we do know what it's like to be priests. And I know what this pressure is like. You have to make sure that the operating fund has enough money in it. You're trying to be present and attentive to people's souls. And that's a challenge to hold those two things together. And I think that the more resources are involved, the harder it is to attend to those things effectively, the secular things, and also attend to like the soul of the diocese and the people who are in it.
Yes, I'll say something that I don't really like, but 100%. One of the things that's coming to mind that I just wrote down that you're helping remind me of in this moment in my own professional challenges as a rector of a congregation is I have to constantly tell myself I am not a CEO.
Right.
And it is very difficult in a capitalist society, in a democratic society in the year 2023, when you are the head of an organization that has an operating budget, to not feel that you are, in many ways, a CEO and you are responsible for certain aspects of the organization that are completely operational and are not spiritual.
And I think that it's kind of axiomatic that when there's a disparity between like values and practice, or when you feel like you've been sold a false bill of goods or something like that, it leads to frustration, anger, depression, things like this. And I think this is one of the reasons why, I made a joke about like, you were joyful for one of your friends and so sad for one of your friends. And I was like, were you joyful for me? It's because everyone knows and senses something that no one actually says about what it's like to be Bishop of New York or almost any other diocese, which is that it's a massive gap between stated expectations of being, as you said, the spiritual figurehead of a whole diocese, and the actual lived reality, which is putting out fires and trying to solve this Rubik's Cube of constantly like, how do you shuffle all these things around to make it actually work? That to me looked like it from the outside, like it would be the biggest challenge. But the other thing I'll say is, you asked, what does a bishop do? Again, ask a bishop that. But a bishop does what a bishop does. Same way that a priest, who a priest is and what a priest does is what you do, Ariane. It's what I do. And so if a priest is focused on the business aspect of a parish, then that's what a priest does. If a priest is, not attending to the business aspects of the parish, but is out walking the streets and meeting everyone, then that's what a priest does. And, that's one of the sort of exciting, but also incredibly challenging aspects of our vocation, is that once you inhabit it, you have to figure out what is that, like how you are the person figuring out what it is. We just had Christmas, and I think all the time about how, like, when you're a priest, this is kind of a crazy thing, but when you're a priest, you kind of, you make Christmas. Like, you have a lot of power. I don't know if folks in the pews think about that. I didn't really think about it until I became a rector, but like in our church, we have a Grammy award-winning Afro-Latin jazz orchestra play at our main Christmas Eve service. That's Christmas, that's Christmas because we have an incredibly talented parishioner who offers himself to do that. And, I'm the priest, and I was like, great.
So, what you're explaining is how we create space. We create something that happens in a space that impacts the way people experience time. However, I really want to go back to something you said. This is something that relates to everybody, whether you are Christian or not, whether you said the massive gap between our expectations of what something will be and the reality of what it is. So this is true in our jobs. This is true in our relationships. This is true when we become parents. This is true when we hit a certain age. This is true once we decide to get remarried. This is true once we decide to get divorced. There is an expectation that we have the thing, we do the thing, and then things will be great, or we will have achieved, but there's always this gap.
Right.
And I think the spirituality, or what it is we seek, is more help with the gap.
Absolutely. Ariane, 100%. You're absolutely right. And that's why, I think, if you're talking about, how do you be ambitious in this vocation? A lot of it was, I did a very deep scouring of my own soul to try to determine what my intentions were in doing this. And once I became comfortable with my intentions, that's when I knew I could go forward. And then I kept checking in about my intentions. And in one of the meet and greet sessions, someone asked a question about that. And I just sort of said what I've been thinking. I was like, look, I didn't enter this process with the intention of getting myself elected bishop of this diocese or any other diocese. I entered into it with the intention of showing you who I really am so that you can actually see that, of telling the truth, even when it's difficult to hear, and of honoring God with my words and my actions. And if you enter kind of any enterprise with intentions that are rooted in a sort of spirituality like you're talking about, then the actual outcome becomes, you relate to it differently, So those are my intentions, and I feel like I fulfilled them. So when the vote came back and I was not elected, I didn't cry. I wasn't sad. I was happy, honestly, that I had completed this process and this was the final endpoint, and I had fulfilled my intentions. I achieved my goal personally. So in the aftermath, of course, I thought about like, well, what if it would have done this and that and everything? But instead, it was, it was an incredible experience in so many ways. And I think that resonated with people. There were people who supported me. My dear friend and colleague, Julia Offinger, gave a nominating speech about me that, to have another human being say those things about you, it's difficult even to put into words how it made me feel. And I think it's like, that's what I got out of it. Had I gone into it just thinking like, okay, I need to do X, Y, and Z in order to get elected, that would have been a very different experience. And I probably would have been disappointed had I not, and not being elected.
Well, I think you offer something in sharing that and revealing that that's really helpful. It's certainly helpful to me, so I'm going to assume it's helpful to other people. It's a process of discernment that's often hard to put the time into, to say, what are my intentions around the expectation I'm setting right now?
Well, maybe part of the discernment is if you don't have the time to do that, maybe it's not a good thing to pursue.
Well, that's a very good point. And maybe even taking a step back to, you use the phrase scour your soul. That sounds like a pretty intense And you know me, I think self-examination is one of the most important things we're here on this earth to do, and a big part of what I think the gospel is all about. But I think it's valuable to hear, because you actually shared something, and I know you, so I know it's not false humility. You said the outcome wasn't as important as being really clear with yourself as to what your intentions were. And therefore, whatever happened, you were okay with it. And in truth, Steve, that's thy will be done, right?
Absolutely.
That's exactly what we pray.
But look, there's a really deep-rooted self-interest in that. I mean, I didn't want to be hurt by the outcome of something that I didn't have any control over. What did I have control over? I had control over my attitude and my intentions. Listen, I've sponsored several people for ordination to the priesthood. The priesthood process is also very difficult. And I ran the discernment process in my diocese for several years. And my number one piece of advice always to people who were thinking of entering discernment was like, be really clear about your intentions. If your intention is to get yourself ordained, it's going to be a rough ride. But if your intention is something else, about offering yourself in an authentic way and deepening your relationship with God, then no one can take that away from you. And I think that's probably true of any pursuit that we're ambitious about. What are your intentions? Again, like look at the people held up as leaders in our society, political leaders, spiritual leaders, cultural leaders. If you look at this is one thing about the political climate. It's like, what are the intentions of these people who get themselves elected to these offices? And we've just kind of resigned ourselves to the fact, like, well, they're all in it for themselves and blah, blah, blah. And that's so messed up. I remember, Ariane, we had a guest lecturer in one of our classes in seminary, and I will never, ever forget this. She said, so we're all sitting in there, I think it was our second year of seminary, and she's like, there was a study done that looked at the rates of narcissistic personality disorder in various careers. And the three highest instances of narcissistic personality disorder are in entertainment, politics, and clergy. So I think one of the potential pitfalls of, say, like in our polity, a bishop process, is that it can be all three.
Yes.
You're clergy, and you're putting your name in there for something that has a lot of attention. And it's entertainment because you're up there on stage and people are looking at you and dissecting everything you say. And as you say, the live stream had 700 views, which is big, for a church election. And it's politics, because it's literally an election. So it has a potential to bring out the most narcissistic side of people. And to be honest, it holds the potential in the way it's structured to attract and reward narcissistic personalities. And that's just the nature of the beast. So my own narcissism, I knew I had to keep that in check, not just like as an act of charity to everyone else, but also for my own self, because I didn't want to get swallowed up in it. We all have narcissistic aspects to who we are, and clergy especially have to like constantly be looking at that. So, I think that this business of kind of like examining what your intentions are, and are they rooted in your spiritual practice? Are they rooted in your values, your stated values? That's kind of like the only safeguard against being swept up in this tide of kind of the negative aspects of ambition.
You're reminding me, why I even started this and want to do these podcast conversations, because I have an intention of wanting to put more words around and wanting more people to talk about the feelings that they have in this line of work, because I think they resonate with feelings in all lines of work, how we think about them, how we change and grow. And one of the gifts of this line of work is that we are actually given many frameworks to choose from to help us scour our soul and to examine our intentions.
Absolutely.
And one of which really is, I think, a foundation of collegial support and a network of people. That was one thing that I'll never forget. A bishop said to me when I asked in an Ember Day letter, what's so important about living in a seminary setting for 3 years? And he said, because you're going to be in community and because of the friendships that you're going to make. They're going to be the friendships that are, you need for your whole career and life. That has proven to be true. So it's just a reminder of how we need to check in with other people too. That's a part of looking at our intentions, has to do with getting feedback from people we can trust and who matter to us.
For sure.
Okay, so I'm trying to,
like, we truly just only scratched the surface.
We just scratched the surface.
I'm so glad you invited me to this 10-part series.
Yes.
Tune in next week.
Well, I mean, we there are some things here that maybe I'm going to ask you to come back and talk about. And I am going to have another friend and colleague, the Reverend Dina Van Claveren, come on and talk about her experience in the process of putting her name forward for leadership position of bishop in the church. Well, thank you for sharing in this conversation and this time with me and sharing some of your story and being vulnerable and courageous. I'm really grateful.
Thank you, Ariane, as always.
Okay, until next time.
All right, take care.